Moving. All right, we're gonna get started. My name is Triple Connell. Like I said, I am the National Program Manager for More Perfect Union. I came to More Perfect Union about a year ago, where I started as a fellow in the 2023 fellow program. And then afterwards, because we were a young, growing organization, they were looking for a program manager. I threw my hat in the ring thinking, well, there's no chance they're going to take a guy like me. And here we are, almost a year later. You all are dealing with me on Fireside chat calls. So I'm extremely happy to be here. I'm extremely happy to introduce you to Mary Tobin. Mary Tobin is our director of programs, not only my friend and my boss, but just a great human being. And Mary, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of your backstory, and then I will get to introducing Jessica, our guest for the night.
Hello, everybody. So happy that you all would make time to spend with us for a little under an hour on a Thursday evening. So thank you for rushing to eat dinner or eating dinner off camera and playing with your kids or petting your dogs, but just making time to discuss with us and share with us and learn more about who we are and what it is we do. I am the proud director of programs here. Thank you, Trip, for the kind introduction. I have the honor of leading 18 Brickyards or chapters through 14 states all over the country. And some of the folks that are Brickyard leaders, like Steve, if you could just wave to the camera there in Hampton Roads, Virginia. He's one of our esteemed Brickyard leaders who helps carry this mission forth every single day. And we operate under the leadership of Garrett Cathcart, our esteemed executive director. Garrett, could you wave at the camera, please? Who works very hard to get us funding each and every day to do what? To strengthen and heal our country by simply working to make our community stronger. And we do this in three ways. We do this through service projects. We do this through civic engagement and social gatherings. We believe that part of the reason why our country is so divided or feels so divided is because people don't know their neighbors anymore. They don't say hi or shake hands or pet folks' dogs or coach each other's little league teams anymore. And so we are creating the environment where people feel safe enough to meet their neighbors. And once they meet them and discover that they're amazing, then they can connect to each other and begin to repair their own communities. And so one of the ways that we connect to many of you who are interested in learning how you can connect to this mission is through things like Fireside Chats, where you can take just a few minutes out of your time during the week to learn more about what we do, to hear more about leaders like Jessica Sutter, who you will learn more about a little bit later, and the work that she does to strengthen our communities and our country. And hopefully at the end of this time together, you will ask yourself, how can I get involved with the green shirts, More Perfect Union? And so that's what we're going to do here tonight. We're going to spend some time learning about an amazing leader with a fireside discussion with Tripp and Jessica Sutter. And then we're going to give you time to ask questions, to get involved and get engaged. And then I know without a shadow of a doubt, after you've heard everything you've heard, asked all your questions, that you too will join what we are doing here in More Perfect Union. So with that being said, Tripp, I'm going to give it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Mary. Terrible choice to give it back to me and let me lead anything, but I will do my best. But that being said, this is the easy job. The easiest part of the call right here is getting to introduce our guest. Her name is Jessica Sutter. I met Jessica. There she is. I met Jessica at one of our MPU events in DC a couple months ago, and immediately hit it off with her, not just because of her amazingly bright and happy and outgoing personality, but ultimately also because of her passion for all things civics and all things education. And we were kind of having a little bit of a brief before we got onto this call to discuss the unique time that we live in, and also the unique intersection of civics and education currently today, and just also how that is just such a unique crossroads of American culture. So a little bit on Jessica's background. And Jessica, I'm going to let you tell the majority of the story. I'm going to give a couple broad strokes here. adjunct lecturer at American University. This is following several years of being a teacher with KIP, social studies teacher. This is, several years of being involved in student to teacher education. And then American University, and then also being a Ward 6 member in Washington, D.C. as an elected public servant, and the D.C. Board of Education president. And I believe that was, 4 years? Which is 1 year less than I spent in college. So and then moving forward into now, which I think is the role where you and I were able to connect in, is that you're currently sitting as the Chief of Civil Learning Initiatives for the Institute of Citizens and Scholars. Did I get all that right? And then can I pass it to you and you give us fill in the blanks with a little bit more heart and soul than what I gave? I just clicked the unmute, so you should be good to go.
Hooray. Yes. Happy to fill in the blanks. And you did a great job, Trip. So thank you for that really kind introduction. And thank you both for having me. I will say the prep calls with Mary and Trip were really fun. So I'm sure tonight will be just as fun. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. I'll add a little color to Trip's introduction. So I started my career as a middle school social studies teacher in a Catholic school in Chicago, Illinois. I went to a Catholic college that really promoted service. And so after college, I spent 2 years as a full-time volunteer teaching in a Catholic school, living with other teachers, and getting a master's degree. And then I moved to California and worked in civic education for a little while because I got really excited about getting to learn more about that. And I traveled all over the country training teachers in civic education curriculum and realized I wanted to go back to a classroom. So I helped open the first KIP school in Los Angeles, California. And then my mother desperately wanted me to come back to the East Coast, and we do what our moms ask us to do. So I moved back to Washington, D.C., where I worked at a KIP school for a few more years, and then got into education policy. My goal with all of that was basically, how do I keep increasing my impact? And funny side story, I thought I'd have a bigger impact in policy than I did as a classroom teacher. Not quite true. You have different impact, deeper impact on your classrooms full of kids, and broader but much more shallow impact doing policy. But I spent a couple years doing policy work. I took a turn as an entrepreneur and started my own consulting business for a little while. Got a PhD in education policy that led me become an adjunct lecturer, and then thought it might be fun to run for office. Another fun side story, when I turned 40, some girlfriends and I went on a vacation. And one of them said, can we all give you challenges over birthday dinner? And I should have known better. I should have said no, but I said yes. And one of the challenges was to do an Ironman triathlon. And I did that. And that was super fun, but also a lot of work. And then the other one was to investigate running for office. And I did it. And I ran for the school board in DC, and I served for 4 years on our state board of education. Decided it was a really good idea to revise the social studies standards back in 2019. So just think about all the things that happened after 2019. I began to wonder at points whether it really was a good idea that we were revising the social studies standards in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a national reckoning over our history and race, in the middle of increasing political polarization. But we did that, and I'm really proud of the new standards we got, because the old ones were 17 years old, and the high school students on the board, as student members, joked that they were really glad that they were finally getting rid of the standards as old as they were and getting to start looking at something new and a new way to address our standards. And now I work for Citizens and Scholars, which is a almost 80-year-old institution. It used to be called the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. And in 2019, we had a new president, took on a new mission to focus on the civic preparation of young people, and decided that we needed a name that really fit that mission. And that was to focus on both scholars who do the work of preparing young people in universities, and also citizens, young people themselves, their classroom teachers, and other youth-serving folks who work with them outside of the university environment. And my work focuses on two things: actually working to prepare young people, so doing more youth-centered and youth-facing work, and then also a piece of our work that's focused on measurement, which is what I got to come talk to to Tripp and folks in DC at the Brickyard about, which is it's really hard to get people to pay attention to something if you don't measure it, right? When we see in the news, we see public opinion polls, we see data, we see changes over time. We're really good at measuring some things in education. We measure math, we measure reading. Now the federal government requires that you measure science in a few grades, but there's no federal mandate to measure civic preparation. There's no federal mandate to make sure that young people know something about the nation's history, its politics, the way they can be involved as citizens, their rights and responsibilities. And the lack of measurement belies the lack of maybe focus that happens in our schools and other education institutions on the topic. So I could pontificate for hours on this stuff, but I'll stop there.
So Jessica, thank you so much for all of that, because I think every time you speak about your background, I learn a little bit more about you. And I also learned, do not ask my girlfriends at a birthday dinner any questions about my life or what I should do, because I'm going to end up running a Ironman or running for office, and I want neither in my life. But I want to rewind just a little bit, right? Because it seems as though you have this very passionate connection to our country by way of education. Could you talk to us a little bit about, was there anything in your childhood growing up? I mean, you could have chosen a lot of different paths, and your mother absolutely seems like she's very influential in your life. What made you say, yes, I'm going to be a teacher, starting in KIPP school in LA, no less. And at some point, yes, it does feel like a good idea to run for office. Like, what is it intrinsically, personally about you that made you go down this path?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Mary. So I'll say my brother is actually the one who got most excited when I ran for office and bought me a whole bunch of books about running for office. He's my baby brother. He's 8 years younger than I am, and he got excited. My parents were both like, "Really, really? You want to like put yourself out there like that? Why would you do that?" And I joke with all the love in my heart, because my parents are wonderful, incredibly supportive people. When I got sworn into office, my family came. My mom, my dad, my grandma, and my aunt came to watch me be sworn in. My aunt is the only one who pays attention to politics. I asked them what they thought of my speech. Got sworn in with my colleagues. I made a speech. And my dad was like, "People talk too much." And my mother said, "Oh, you always do a good job public speaking. You have for years." And my grandmother was very focused on the shoes of all the people being sworn in. She had a lot of compliments for the many shoes. There were some beautiful shoes on stage that night. But I say all that to say, it's not because my family is deeply invested in politics or civics. My family is deeply invested in service. So my mother's a nurse, and she was a nurse for 43 years before she retired last year. And my grandmother's brothers and uncles and aunts served in the military. And when I was growing up, I was raised in the Catholic faith tradition, and there was an expectation that service was part of what we did and a way we were connected to our community. So I think that was just sort of the water I swam in growing up. And then the Jesuits have a motto that is men and women for and with others, which I think adds a layer to the service. You're not just doing service to other people, you are doing it with, in proximity to, and in allegiance with the folks that you're trying to serve. So for me, education felt like a natural way. I always liked school. And I thought, well, I liked school. School might be a good place for me to go spend my talents. And a priest on campus when I was in college suggested, "Had you thought about being a teacher?" And it sounded like maybe a voice from the universe telling me that that's a thing I ought to do. So that became sort of how I entered education. But for me, I don't know. I think it's a thing that you say, I've got a lot of things going right for me. How do I help other people get access to that same kind of potential to enable and make their dreams reality?
I love that so much. And Tripp is going to dive a little bit deeper into the specifics around the impact that you are making and have made in several different types of community. But before we move to that, I want to ask a follow-on question to that. I used to wrestle deeply with this idea around, well, I'll back up and say my favorite motto, my favorite quote is one by Muhammad Ali that says, the service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. And so I have this belief that everyone has these gifts and talents that they are endowed with, and they are supposed to give that back into the earth. Now, the reality is there are many people who don't necessarily feel that way. And there's a sense of rugged individualism, right? Like I not only just taking care of me, but taking care of my family. If my family is okay, if we have enough, if we are safe, if my kids go to college, if I get my pension, then that is the American dream. I've done my duty. My kids are not in jail. They're not menaces. I pay my taxes. Jessica, get off my back. I don't owe you anything else. I don't need to serve anyone else. And then here it is, you exist. And MPU, More Perfect Union, is trying to encourage people all across the country to do more service. Why do you think, or do you think, let me ask that question, do you think service is or should be a part of this discussion about the American dream, or what we as citizens owe, if anything, to this country?
Yeah, I love that question, because for me, the answer is easy. Like, yes, of course. But I think what service is and what service looks like is often talked about in a few discrete ways rather than being considered on all its levels. So I live in a condo building in Washington, DC, which means by its very nature, like, my neighbors are literally out the door. Across the hall, there's two neighbors. In our building, I can't just take care of me, even though I have my unit and I am responsible for it. Like, we've got some shared responsibilities in this building, and we have to look out for one another. And that's a form of service. Just looking out for your neighbors, knowing who they are. I mean, I think we've got a pretty great building in Washington, DC, but we've got a really interesting multi-generational building. So I've got folks in the building who are retired and getting on in years. We've got young folks in the building too. It's important to just look out for one another because someone ought to. Oh, I haven't seen so and so in a few days. Have you heard from them? Anyone know what's going on? Oh, I heard so and so was on vacation. Should we bring those packages in until they get back? It's not a small thing to know that you are looking out for the people around you and caring for them. And I think that in of itself is a form of service. And then you go up the levels. You can do service as a profession. You can do service as a mission. You can do a very self-serving kind of professional life, whether you get involved in finance or real estate or business and entrepreneurship, and find ways to serve your community and your neighbors in addition to that, or via some sort of social enterprise business. I think for me, the only lie about, rugged individualism is that it all happened on your own. At some point, somewhere, someone looked out for you, either in your family or outside of it. And that in of itself is a form of service. And I think we've got to be honest with ourselves about that. And then also think about what we do that acts as service to others, whether it be small or great, and how that might change over time.
Look, I really love that answer. And Mary, I really appreciate those questions. That kind of leads me almost perfectly into my question, right? Which is, you have a lot of folks on the call who are, prior service military in some way, shape, or form. So, and like you said, I think service, it was ingrained in me. Yeah, my father was in the Army. My uncles were in the Army. My other uncle was in the Navy. We don't talk about him, but the rest, service is ingrained in some of us. But for so many, it isn't, right? And I think one of the age-old tropes is that, well, young people are great. They'll go out and they'll protest and they'll post online or they'll do this and that, but they don't vote. And some of that might be true. But, my first question for you is, how true is that? And then two, if it is true or isn't true, whatever level of, because you are the subject matter expert here on this, is however true it is or isn't, what do you think are the biggest causes for that? And are they systemic? Are they, because you kind of got a little bit of this in your intro and talking about, changing the curriculum in 2018, 2019, and some of these other pieces, what are the follow-on pieces for that? Hey, youth in the country, 18 to 24, are engaging in civics at X level. And then here's why. What is kind of your overall thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you set me up really nicely, Trip. We did a survey in September of last year of 4,000 young people, 18 to 24 across the country, asking them questions about their civic knowledge, their civic engagement, and their commitment to democracy. And when we talked about commitment to democracy, we talked about it as trust, both trust in institutions and trust in other people, and also their willingness to work inside the system of democracy in order to solve problems. So working with the system versus resorting to violence. One of the things I thought was really interesting is when we asked young people how many of them thought their vote was important, we had numbers in the high 60s. Their vote matters. They think their vote is important. But then you ask them if they're going to vote in the 2024 general election, and only 48% said they would. And I get curious. I want to know what's that about. So we haven't done formal qualitative research to follow up on it, but I've asked some young people, and we have a great, I'll put a plug in for our website. We have a great conversation I had with two young people, a young woman who's a freshman at Syracuse University, who calls Washington, DC her home, and a young man who's a junior at the University of Iowa, who calls, I want to get his town right, Newton, Iowa, his home. Grew up on a farm, works for the office of the governor in Iowa. They are politically different. They grew up in very different places. They have very different perspectives on America. But both of them noted that they think their generation has work to do to be involved civically. One of the things I heard about that reluctance to vote is not in that conversation, but in another, the closed primaries are really hard for young people because if they haven't selected a political party to identify with, and their state has closed primaries, by the time they get to the general election, they're left with candidate choices that have been selected by folks who are not representative of their political viewpoints. So in that same survey, young people, 22% identified as Democrats, 17% identified as Republicans, and the rest said to us, a pox on both your houses, not interested in what you have to offer. Well, if that's true, in these primary elections that are happening, you're not getting the voices of those young people going out to vote in closed primaries. So for me, one of the questions is, how do we listen to young people when they tell us their truth? And then think about, are there system fixes that could change things, not to benefit one side of a perspective or the other, but to open the gates to more people who want to come in and participate? So would we get more of those young people to vote if you didn't have to first register with a party and say, yeah, I endorse that platform to get into their primaries? I think another thing we've learned from young people about their civic engagement is that they think they're involved civically in ways that I'm not sure the rest of us would agree that is civic involvement. So I heard recently from a consultant working with our organization that members of Gen Z report that signing a petition has a greater impact than taking a job in government. And I thought, like, are you kidding? But if that's what they're feeling, right? If they feel like, well, I'm not going to make a difference by going to get a government job and doing the work of civil service, it's just as good for me to sign a petition and say, this is my opinion. We have done them a disservice in their education in helping them understand how democracy works. That petitions are one way you share your thoughts, but taking a job, working the system, voting for office, volunteering for candidates, signing up to run yourself, or crazy idea, going to local government meetings and sharing your thoughts with the folks actually making the policy in real time. I think one of the things that is wearing my old elected official hat, it's really easy to say, well, I represent the people and I know what the people want, if only a few people come to talk to you. So we actually did like an audit of all the public witnesses who came to our state board meetings. And we found that some public witnesses came to every meeting for years. If that's the voice we're hearing every meeting, that's not representative of the public. That's representative of this person who comes out to every meeting. And I think we miss a lot when we don't hear the voices of young people in our meetings. I think the flip side of that is public meetings can be really painful. So how do we make public meetings better? How do we make them less painful, not just for young folks, but for the folks Mary called out at the beginning of our meeting, the folks who are trying to play with their kids or throw the ball to the dog or eat their dinner, they're not going to come and sit through a 5-hour public meeting that starts at 7 p.m. at this one location on this one day. So how do we think more about engaging the public, I think is very important for youth involvement, but I think it's important for everybody.
No, look, that's very eye-opening because, you know, the common discussion is, oh, well, young people don't get involved. And, you know, that might be true to an extent, but what you're saying is it's not that they don't get involved, it's they're getting involved in a way that they think is beneficial to them. But then, you know, secondarily, you know, for us, as we say, the debate is, well, how effective are you being? But also, how effective are the systems that we actually have set up for them to participate in? You know, and what is it? I believe I'm probably going to butcher this Martin Luther King quote, but what is it? Is that riots are the language of the unheard? And, you know, if you have a system that doesn't allow people to participate and feel like their engagement is actually worthwhile, what's going to be their outlet, right? So, you know, on that topic, and this is, you know, Jessica Sutter as the human, not necessarily Jessica Sutter as the speaker of the the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. You know, if you were to give us any, hey, this is the way that we could make these public meetings, you know, more appropriate and more open for people to engage in, you know, kind of what would you think that would look like? Two, you know, what do you think we are doing as a society that is missing our ability to communicate with young folks? Because there are so many, and what I've heard, at least in my engagement, in an urban city like Austin, Texas, is that there's so much information and there's so many avenues to get information out there that the stuff that's actually important very much gets lost in the sauce. And then conversely, you know, Vaughn, our director of rural strategies, and I were recently just on a road trip in Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon. And these are the lesser populated sides of very populated states. And we were going through these rural towns and they all very much said the same thing, is that, hey, we are small town folk and we don't get any say in our state politics because all of it happens on the other side of the state where all the population centers are. So, you know, we're seeing this with young folks, we're seeing it with rural folks. I'm sure we're seeing it in all different aspects of society. So, you know, what would you, you know, if you were, you know, queen for the day and able to say, this is what we're going to change, you know, what would you say?
So I give a couple of examples. One, the first sort of tenet I give about like involving young people and doing a better job. And I say this with love because I don't know anyone on this call very well, but I think a lot of people think, yeah, I mean, I listen to young people. But it's really quite a different thing to hear a young person speak to you and say, oh, okay, all right, fine. And it's another thing to say like, okay, I heard you. Tell me why you think that. Well, how would that work? Well, what about this? Help me understand how you came up with that idea. I think we adults often forget that young people don't often get engaged in genuine conversation where we see them as peers with ideas, even though they're much younger, have less education, or have less life experience than us. And when you listen to young people in genuine ways and you ask them questions and you take them seriously, they get really excited. I had a really wonderful conversation with a set of young folks called the National Student Board Member Association. They're an association of the student representatives to school boards all across the country. And a funder that we were talking with offered to make the introduction because I was like, wow, that sounds so cool. I'd like to meet with them. And when we met with them, their immediate response when we got on the Zoom was, you're the first adult who responded to our email. And I thought, well, that's just crappy. Like, who else are you writing to? And can I call them and be like, no, you need to take this meeting. So I think there's a real opportunity and a real opening for adults who are willing to listen to young people like they're people with ideas who happen to be younger, not like they're kids. And I mean this, you know, certainly for college age kids and kids over, I use the term kids too loosely. Young people over the age of 18, but under the age of 25, great. High school students, 100%. But middle schoolers and like fifth graders, you will be surprised at how many amazing ideas come out of the mouth of a 10-year-old. because they're
Oh, I bet.
thinking all the time. And again, I don't think they often get asked questions and taken seriously when they share their ideas or their wonderings about how things are working. So that's like a basic tenet. But the two examples I'd give, we held a State Board of Education forum on different topics. And we held it on a weekend here in DC at one of the local high schools. Well, we also reached out to a couple of the youth serving organizations, and we reminded them this will count for community service hours if you want to send students to come. In DC, kids have to complete 100 hours of community service as part of their high school graduation requirement. And so we held this forum on a Saturday. We held it at a local high school. It was convenient that it was also the place where sports physicals were happening that day. So you had a line of young people and their folks waiting out on the sidewalk to come in for their sports physical. And we had all sorts of families come through, but we had more kids at this issues forum that was not designed for young people. It was designed for the community to come in. Having it on that day at a school where young people were going to be for another purpose ended up with a lot more kids coming in and sharing their thoughts on the city's education system. So I think one way to improve public meetings is thinking about where are you holding them, when, how can you make them adjacent to other things people are already coming to, and how can you welcome in voices that are often not present, because new voices help meetings stink less, right?
Love it.
The second thing I'd say, and I think this is really relevant to your point about rural situations, is that in Tennessee, they just redid the funding formula. And one of the things that their former state superintendent, a woman named Penny Schwinn, talked about in presenting that funding formula is the way in which they made sure that everybody won in the funding formula, getting something that fit their specific situation and need. So for the first time in Tennessee's history, rural counties get a special multiplier. So any rural school district gets an extra multiplier in the funding formula because of the low population density. Because there's often a focus on the urban centers in a place like Tennessee, where there's like, well, urban centers have higher density, more issues, lots of students that need wraparound services. And the rural school districts were saying, okay, we got all that, and we've got these school buses that are traversing for hours to get children to their schools. So we actually have the same level of financial need that you're already ascribing to the urban centers. So can we get a special multiplier? And they did. And it cost the state money, but it was a recognition that this is an important thing we're doing for all of the children in our state. And all of the children in our state have unique and special needs, and we should attend to that. I should say this all happened in a state where it was a red state at the time, right? There was red control in the state legislature. So this was a funding formula that might be considered a progressive funding formula, but it was done specifically to benefit parts of the state that often felt like they were unheard and unlistened to. So I think that's a second sort of tenet, is like, how do you find the folks who aren't being listened to and specifically go hear what they have to say? And then think about how you build a system that might work, that addresses some of the things that are the language of the unheard.
Wow. That's so interesting. And just to tie that a little bit into MPU is, look, we are not an organization that says, hey, politics A, politics B. But we are an organization that believes that, you know, civic engagement is extremely important. And it's part of our responsibility and our duty as citizens of this country to engage. And often you see that the discussion is guided by, well, if you think this, then you are on this side of the line. And if you think that, then you're on that side of the line. And depending on what side of the line you are on, depends on whether I can agree with you and or be friends with you and or invite you to Thanksgiving. What it sounds like you're saying is that even in a state that is, you know, at the time, like you said, a red state, people can come together and say, it's probably a good idea for us to invest in the education of our young folks in the country. Is that what I'm hearing? I'm just trying to make sure maybe we plant a flag there for us.
It's a wild notion, actually. I'll give you one more wild notion that is not so much education, but I make everything education. Last summer, my partner Jason and I rode RAGBRAI. Anyone familiar with RAGBRAI? It's the
Ride across Iowa.
Yeah, Register's annual Great Bike Ride across Iowa, sponsored by the Des Moines Register. Originally, it was the 50th anniversary. It's a 7-day, roughly 500-mile bike ride. And the thing about it is, you start
and it's rough.
Iowa, and you go to the other end.
People think it's Iowa and it's flat, but it's not.
No, it's not that. There were great t-shirts that said it's as flat as a waffle, up and down and up and down. But from the Missouri River to the Mississippi River, you ride through a lot of small towns. We hit a couple of big cities that year. So we hit both Ames and Des Moines. We hit Coralville and Iowa City, but we had a lot of small towns. And one of the things that I marveled at, this is last summer, during the crazy lead up to this election, I didn't talk to anybody who talked about politics. In 7 days for 500 miles, we met lots of Boy Scouts who were selling burritos at breakfast time. We met lots of different folks from civic organizations like the 4-H. We met folks from church groups. We met folks from the VFW who all came out to support the riders as they came through. But I really, in 7 days, did not talk to a single person about politics. And I'm kind of a politics junkie. So I think there's also a notion that people can come together with a shared interest and a shared purpose and spend time in places. I'd never been to Iowa before. And I got full of that Iowa State hospitality over that week, but it was wonderful and really a fascinating opportunity to see how people can come together for a civic purpose that is not driven by one side or the other.
Look, I personally love that story because I mentioned that Vaughn and I went on a road trip through, this rural part of, Northwest and verging on Pacific Northwest part of the country. And, maybe Garrett can chime in on this a little bit later, but it seems that people said, you went to the rural parts of the country and talked to people? That is crazy. And it very much aligns exactly with the story that you're telling, is that we are very much told in this kind of public rhetoric that, if you go here, not good. If you talk to that person, no bueno. If you engage with these people, they're not going to be the people that you like, and threat. And you very much see that whether you're driving in a car, two guys wearing the same hoodie and pulling up into small towns where they don't see, two random folks that they don't see very often wearing the same clothes, showing up with an iPhone, asking them questions, thinking that we wouldn't be welcomed, being welcomed right in. Or it's, someone who has spent an extensive amount of time on the East Coast in Washington, DC, or as some people call it, the swamp, showing up in the middle of Iowa and riding a bike all the way across the country and having this experience. That's very much a story that we don't think it's unique publicly, but I don't think that it is unique to America. It's just not one that gets told often. So I'm really glad you just brought that up, because I think it very much speaks to the heart and soul of MPU. But one thing that you said that kind of, I don't want to say triggered me, but it triggered me before, is you say, hey, I take everything back to education. I take everything back to civics, right? That's that crossroads. I think this is not the first time in the United States that we've been at a very crucial and critical crossroads of civics and education. And I don't know if anyone's watched the news anytime in the last week, but there's certainly some engagement on college campuses going on right now. And so without necessarily leaning heavily into the whole politics of the argument, one of the things that is right on the main page of the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, it says, the college presidents for civic preparedness, right? So great sentence. I think everyone can get behind that. But then it says 61 college presidents committed to advancing the principles of critical inquiry, free expression, little asterisk over that one, and civil discourse on their campuses, right? Obviously, that's being tested. This is not the first time it's been tested. There's been times throughout history. We were talking about it with Mary, is that, you saw a huge change in the civil rights movement when young folks started getting involved. Kent State during Vietnam is one that everyone remembers. It's not new to young folks, because you made a comment earlier about, hey, when you're 10 and you're 11 years old, you got a lot of energy and a lot of time. And there's not a lot of things pulling at you. So you have time to think. And, overall for you live right at that intersection of civic education, of civic engagement and education. Do you think that in the current environment, there are things that can be being done differently and that we can improve upon as a country, in terms of dealing with supporting, changing, approaching this conversation? But then also, hey, are things actually going well? Is it working? Is is this an example of kids out there doing the thing that they think they should be doing, whether you agree or disagree with, the stance that they're taking, aside. We talked about in our pre-call, Charlottesville, you had a white power rally walking through the University of Virginia, and these guys had torches, and widely disagreed with, widely disliked, but it is their First Amendment right. And it's a very weird space and difficult space for a lot of us in the country to be able to see people saying things that we don't agree with. But it's right there in the First Amendment, so you being right at that intersection of all these things happening, kind of what's your overall assessment of how it's going, what can be done better? And then also like, hey, this is what's going great. I know it's very broad, but again, subject matter expert, I very much look for your opinion.
Also a totally easy question, Trip, like super.
not hot button at all. Not hot button at all.
No. So I'm going to give you my work hat answer, and then I'm going to give you my Jessica hat answer. So
fantastic.
To Trip's point, on our organizational website, you can find information about the College Presidents for Civic Preparedness, and just a little more background on that. We've got these 61 college presidents. Last year, it started pretty small. It was like 12 college presidents who came together and said, we think that our university friends have lost the thread, that colleges are a place where we're supposed to be seeing ourselves preparing young people for their role in democracy, not just to get their engineering degree and get out the door and be done. And to your point, Mary, go back to their self-interest. So colleges should be a place where we continue the civic preparation of young people. And this recent new launch of our website on College Presidents for Civic Preparedness talks about the civic commitments, and there are 3 of them. One is educating for democracy is central to our mission. So this is saying we as college presidents will say that this is work, preparing young people for democracy is our job. And we're going to say that in our convocations. We're going to say that in the ways that we invite speakers to campuses. We're going to say that in the programming that's offered on campuses. We're making a commitment to do this. The second one is we will prepare our students for a vibrant, diverse, and contentious society. And hold on to that word contentious for a second, because I think one point I would make is that if you look at our list of college presidents and you look at the protests and the headlines this week, where things have gone beyond contentious, where there have been arrests made or where there's been press, you won't see an overlap between the presidents in this consortium and what's happened on campuses that has blown up to a headline level. I don't think that's an accident. I think that's a point worth paying attention to. And then I think the third civic commitment is we will protect and defend free inquiry. And the thing I'll sort of stop there on the CNS side, because I'll say too, this is relatively new work for us. We've been at it for about a year. We've had some faculty workshops on cultivating free inquiry and discussion across difference in college classrooms. We had a great webinar, and unfortunately, I think it was like a closed door webinar only to a select audience, but I'll share one of the things a young person said in the webinar with you all. We had 2 college professors, 2 college students who had been part of our youth fellowships at Citizens and Scholars, and then a former teaching fellow who's now a doctoral candidate as moderator. So we got fellows from all of our programs, and it was a wonderful discussion. But a young woman who's a freshman at Stanford was one of our guests, and she said, I grew up in Chicago. She's a Black woman, and she said, I didn't assume anyone thought like me. It's a giant city filled with so many different kinds of people. Why would I think anyone thinks like me? On campus, it feels like there's a right way to think. And so sometimes I don't say the thing that's on my mind because I'm afraid that maybe it's not the right thing. And maybe I'm going to get blowback for that. Listening to this dynamic young woman say she doesn't say the thing that's on her mind because she's afraid of the consequences is, I think, the thing that we're trying to tackle with this College Presidents for Civic Preparedness work. To say that free inquiry in a contentious society means that I might say something that you say, I don't like that. I disagree with that. But how do we keep the conversation going rather than stopping the conversation and turning to, holding signs at one another across the street? How do you actually keep the discourse happening? One of the things that we're grappling with is discourse to what purpose? Are we discussing to try to get to the same place? Well, that's pretty hard and maybe not the right goal. Are we discussing to understand one another better? Well, that might be a better goal. Or are we discussing to recognize that different people can have different ideas on the same topic because there might not be a right answer? There might also not be a wrong answer. There may be multiple answers that different people are going to bring on this. And I don't say that to be kumbaya. So I'm going to stop my citizens and scholars talk, and now I'll say the thing for me that is really painful to watch in all of this is that I think the rights of students to protest are fundamental and really important to honor. And I think, and I'll go back to, my education hat, I think we've failed to prepare them to do all the other things that could also be part of their civic life that are not protesting. So I think some students are protesting in the way that they are because it's the thing they know how to do, the thing they've seen done, the thing they think will make a change, the thing they think will lead to policy change, to ending conflicts they don't like, to divesting from things they find objectionable. There are other ways to do that too, but I think it may be happening and we're not hearing about it because it's not as powerful a nightly news story. Or they may not be doing it in the same numbers and with the same intensity because they haven't had a chance to build that muscle or practice that skill. And I think that's a skill and a muscle we've got to help them practice. I just got to do a high school constitution competition. I got to judge high schoolers doing their constitutional knowledge. It's called We the People. It's like a fabulous nerd fest of high schoolers from all over the country. But one of the things I thought was so fascinating was they talked about the election of 1800. It's called the Revolution of 1800. This is the one where you end up with the tie between Jefferson and Burr. And if you've seen Hamilton the musical, you know a little bit about how that all goes down. But they talked, and it was so fun to watch 15, 16, and 17-year-olds say, they wrote really nasty things about one another. Like they said that if Jefferson was elected, you'd have prostitution running wild in the streets. You're like, yeah, so this notion of talking badly about your opponent isn't new, but they used to write these diatribes against one another. And I think about that as well. Like, have we helped young people build the muscle on like, what if you saw these incredibly powerful dueling op-eds in the pages of major newspapers from college student body presidents? I'm not seeing that play out in the same way, but that would have an impact too. And so I hope that we continue to develop civic engagement skills in all sorts of ways with young people.
Look, I love that. I think there's obviously a world for it. I heard someone the other day say, just a reminder that rap beefs are just two grown men writing angry poems at each other. So, there is, and that's selling a lot of albums. So there's obviously a hunger for it. How do we transition that to our political and civic engagement? So I love that. Look, what I would love to do now is, we've got about 7 more minutes. We may go over depending on the questions, but seriously, if we would love to have open the forum up for you guys to answer and ask questions for Jessica and have Jessica give you the opportunity to answer them. If you don't want to come off mute, if you don't want to share your video, it's totally fine. You can put your question in the chat and we will ask Jessica directly. If you don't want to put it in the chat openly and you want to send it to Mary or myself directly, we can answer it. We would love to have you all do that. I know that I threw out something to Garrett earlier and see if he wanted to comment. Vaughn, I dropped your name 3 times. So, if anyone wants to chime in, we've got, about another 7 minutes. So the floor is open. If you want to come off mute, please just raise your hand and I'll get you in the game. And then obviously, Mary, I know I kind of stole the floor there a little bit. If you have any follow-up questions, go for it.
No, Q&A it is. I think I saw Garrett's hand, our executive director.
Oh, I was ignoring that one.
I didn't know I had to get permission to be unmuted. This is an amazing way to control a crowd. Technology is amazing.
This is civic engagement.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Sutter, Jessica, for making time for being here, but also more importantly for a lifetime of legacy of service, both what we call the tactical level in the military, in the classroom, like with students literally being a frontline leader and being a mentor that changes the course of their lives, all the way up to policy, like you said, deep impact, but then coming back down into the classroom, right? I mean, what, how well informed is that policymaker when they're doing the thing with the people, right? They're meaning to serve, and up to including public office. And so, one is an example to all of us. So thanks for your service. That's all I want to say. I got a lot of questions, but there's only 5 minutes left, so maybe at another time.
Well, thanks, Garrett. I appreciate that.
Garrett, you know what they say is that the only time is now. So,
oh, all right. So I mean, obviously,
and then I've got one from Kimberly after this. So go ahead.
About what you're talking about, and a couple obviously struck a lot of chords, but building trust between people and institutions. I mean, I'm a little biased. I think what we do best is building trust between people through different mechanisms, built bonding. Certainly not writing across the entire state of Iowa. That's probably a bonding mechanism. But how do you build trust to institutions, right? I mean, one of our pillars is civic engagement. I had another question what is civics, right? I mean, I Google it and there's 100,000 definitions. So maybe what is civics? And then how do you build trust in an institution when no one knows what truth is anymore, right?
So I like the easy questions, Garrett. Thank you for that. Much appreciated. Softballs. I'll do the trust in institutions one though. I think your statement about we do a good job, MPUs working to build trust with people. I think people forget that institutions are just places where people work and where people make decisions. And so for me, part of it is reminding and helping institutions remind the people they're trying to work with and serve that they are people-driven places. Now, I mean, I'll go back to my doctoral program and I can pull out all sorts of institutional theory that talks about how problems happen when people get institutionalized in their thinking. But I think there's a real, again, I'll use some of the institutions I've worked with, some that do it well and some that do it badly. So the state board, I think one of the things we kept reminding the public of is for better or for worse, we're the only body in education in DC that had a monthly forum where any member of the public could come talk about anything they wanted. You didn't have to talk about an item that was on the agenda. You come talk about anything. Now, charter schools in DC have public meetings. It's only a few years old. The law changed. Now their meetings are public. I'm on the board of a public charter school. And once a month, we have a public meeting. Any member of the public can come and talk to us about any topic that's on their mind during the meeting. I have great fondness and affection for our mayor here in DC, but you know who doesn't have a public meeting that any member of the public can just come to ask her any question they want? The mayor doesn't have that. And the DC Council has meetings, but there are hearings on very specific topics, and you have to come talk about the topic. The individual council members have coffees or different meet and greets, but I think institutions need to do a better job of saying, my job is to serve you. I got to listen to you, and then I got to make space for that. And I'll own this. Those meetings are tedious. They are long. Sometimes you have people come talk about topics that you're like, really? This is what you wanted to come talk about? But this is democracy, the voice of the people. How do we do that? So I think at its base, it's helping people realize that institutions are staffed by people. And then on the flip side, forcing institutions to actually connect more often with the people they serve. And I think you see examples of orgs that do that, like institutions that do that well, and others that do it poorly. And I'm going to shout out the National Park Service. If you don't follow their Instagram or social media accounts, you need to, because they are hilarious. And they're doing this really intentional effort to connect with all kinds of people on the fact that hey, national parks rangers are fun and funny. And they are, but they are an institution that has figured out a way to break through the din and say connect with us. We're going to try and get out of our shell of big federal agency and actually communicate with the people in the way that people talk to one another.
There was definitely getting out of the shell joke there with the National Park Service that I think was a missed opportunity. So I'm glad we got that on recording. We can get back to that one. Kimberly brought this one up, and Kimberly, congratulations, UConn men's basketball champions. And it wasn't really a question, but she said, hey, at UConn, where she graduated from, there's an encampment going on now. And she said, I wish I had learned more in undergrad about different ways to be civically engaged. It doesn't mean that those days are over for you, Kimberly. There's other ways that you can get involved. And so, Jessica, do you have any recommendations from you to say, hey, this is where a resource center for you, Kimberly, and or other folks who are interested to go and say, hey, this is how I can get civically engaged?
Yeah, I mean, one, I think MPU is a good start because I think the kinds of people who come to your events are already engaged in lots of ways and places. So you go to MPU and you meet different people who are doing different things, and they're likely to invite you to come along. And so I think um, I didn't get involved in sports until I was in my 30s, right? I was not an athletic kid. So I think about the reason I went to my first run club was because a friend invited me along. So then I went to this run club and I learned they went out for beers afterwards. And I like running much more when there's a reward at the end. And when friends are involved. So I think going to a group like MPU is a good way to meet people who are civically engaged and do that. I think the other thing is like communities don't always do a great job of publicizing where they publish their public meeting notices. But if you have a local newspaper, here in DC, we have a couple local newspapers.
Yep.
We have a publication called the Hill Rag that does a lot of stuff that just is in the greater Capitol Hill area. And they'll post all the public meetings that are coming up and summaries of different public meetings that went on. They also publish volunteer opportunities that are happening in and around. And then I'd say there are a lot of like historic civic institutions that are national that have outposts. So the Lions Club or the Rotary Club will often post opportunities, not just with them, but with partner organizations and community organizations to get involved. And I find that for better or for worse, the people who are involved in one of those organizations tend to be involved in more than one of those organizations. So going to one and picking a place to start is a good way to meet folks doing lots of different things in your community, and going from there.
Awesome. Look, we have one more question, and I know we're at time, so we'll have you close this one out, and then Mary will close us out with, in her amazing way that she always does, with kind of giving us all passion and purpose, but then also direction. I love being like, woo, open vector. Mary likes being like, woo, do this, which is why we work so well together. But, you know, Maina said this, and she said, do you have thoughts on juxtaposition? And the context to that is, you know, a little bit of, you know, her own personal experiences, seeing interesting divide in education right now, where we have highly educated students who are wanting to get involved, and yet also students who, you know, with lesser education background, you know, having issues communicating, struggling to comprehend texts and or even read and write. You know, so you just have this drastic disparity from one end of the spectrum to the other. And do you see that juxtaposition and that disparity causing issues in terms of young folks being able to engage?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. And then two, I'm trying to think of how to best frame this, but I think I'll say it this way. Kids are so smart that they sometimes know what's worth their time and what's not worth their time. And so when you have kids who are struggling academically, for me, the question is always like, well, why? Is it because the quality of their instruction hasn't been great? That's certainly true for some kids. Is it that the content of what they're being asked to tackle isn't being framed for them in a way that makes them want to care about it? When I first started teaching middle school, my mentor teacher said, by the way, before the holiday breaks, sex and death. And I said, what? She's like, that's what we teach. We teach sex and death before the holidays. And I was like, we are talking about seventh graders, right? And she's like, yeah, we tend to either pick a war in the history books to teach, or we do like Romeo and Juliet, because sex and death sells when it comes to seventh graders before the holidays. And it's a funny thing, but her point is well put, which is that you got to know your audience and figure out what's going to hook them into the conversation. So that's another thing I always wonder about when kids are not prepared. But then I want to add on to that. I think the flip side is, how do we help them get engaged even as they're still building their academic skill and rigor muscles? And there I got to shout out one of my favorite youth civics orgs. It's called MIKVA Challenge, MIKVA Challenge. It's headquartered in Chicago, and it does programming with teachers and students in largely urban centers. They're a big presence in Chicago, a big presence in Washington, DC, programming in New York City. And they have a thing called the Soapbox Series. In classrooms, they ask teachers to help students identify an issue in their community they care about. And then they help them do the research to learn as much as they can about that issue and to propose a public policy solution. And then they literally stand up on a soapbox and give that speech. Here's what I care about in my community. Here's what I've learned about the problem. Here's what I think the solution is and why you should agree with me. And then they go to a citywide competition. And it is amazing to watch these kids, many of whom are struggling readers, many of whom are not confident public speakers, who have said, You want me to talk about a thing that I care about that affects me and my neighbors and my friends and my family, and someone's going to listen to me and then give me feedback on that? Okay, I'm in. And they begin to build the skills, both in their academic reading, writing skills, but also in their public speaking and confidence along the way. So I think we got to think about how we take kids where they are and bring them along with us on the journey.
I literally have been taking notes since you've been talking, Jessica, and I know that there's other people that have too. And that's part of the reason why we make this recording, because we're going to share this with everybody. There's been lots of folks who've been hopping in and out. I'm sure they've been taking care of family and things, and we're going to share this across all of our platforms. But I echo the sentiments of Garrett. First of all, thank you for your service, your continued service to this country. Thank you for your belief in our mission at MPU, that we actually can strengthen and heal our communities over good meals and conversation and service in our communities. And thank you for dropping gems and research and organizations that we should be connected to, as well as yours, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. And so I want to ask a question. How do we connect to the work that you do and support what you are doing, since you've been so supportive of us, especially our DC Brickyard? How do we connect to you, Jessica?
I love it. Well, first, we are on a couple of social media platforms, and it helps us to get elevated, to have our work elevated when folks follow us there. So you can find us on LinkedIn, you can find us on Facebook, you can find us on X. And we post about our research and our work there. So if you read something that we're up to that is of interest to you, there's an email you can reach out to. There's a College Presidents for Civic Preparedness email. There's a general story email where you can tell us about work you're doing that you think we should know about and be connected to. And then you can follow along with the research and projects that we're working on. The second plug I'll put in, and I will send this so that it gets out to the MPU community, we're hoping later this summer to launch what we're calling a Youth Civic Solutions Competition, where we put out an open call around a couple of topics, and we ask young people to send us their ideas for how they would solve these issues. And we're going to publicize that competition. There's going to be cash prizes. We're very excited. We just got a funder to agree to help us do that work.
Outstanding.
So,
Congratulations.
when we get that up and running, I'd love to share it with the MPU network, because we want to make sure that this gets out to young people all over the country. We don't want to just be sending it to our networks. We want to be sending it to our networks and their networks, so that we get as large a student response as we can.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you saw Maina put the big red exclamation point. So she is standing by to support this. She has been very adamant about us connecting to the young people in our country who are a part of this civic engagement movement. And so I love that. Please give us the opportunity to amplify your work. The last thing I'll say is, in the words of the great scholar and philosopher who often says, I'm about that action, Marshawn Lynch. I love when we connect to leaders such as yourself, who not only dive into the academic and the scholarly work around the philosophy around unity and democracy and civics and education, but you actually put action behind that. So thank you for modeling what it looks like to put into practice the ideas that make our country great. And we're very, very grateful for you and this connection and this collaboration. Thank you, everybody, for showing up and for being attentive and for connecting to and following Citizens and Scholars. We have some of the links in the chat. Go ahead and follow it on social media and connect. The last thing I'll say is this. If you are not a part of the MPU family, More Perfect Union, I need you to go ahead and go to that website right now and join the movement. Go ahead, put your name, your email, phone number, whatever you're comfortable with, and join the movement. You'll get our newsletter, you'll get our emails, you'll get messages that remind you to come to amazing events to hear amazing people like Jessica Sutter. And I'll also remind you to do things like apply for our fellowship that is closing in the next 36 hours. So we have an amazing fellowship that makes our leaders, trains our leaders who build our chapters in cities all over the country. If you have been on a fence about applying and you want to be a part of what we're doing, you want to be like Steve right here in the middle of my screen, then you need to apply right now. Don't worry about it. Just go ahead and apply, because I'm waiting on you. And because you came to this event, you probably have a leg up on other people too, because I'm going to remember your name. So go ahead and apply. We look forward to working with you. And lastly, always remember that it is a lot of people who spend a lot of time complaining about the problems in this country, but it takes someone who is brave, courageous, and someone who wants to see this country better to do something about it. Don't be complaining. Come on, get in the fight. Help us do something about this work and help us do something about the problems and the division that you see in this country. Because I believe together that we can heal and strengthen our country, and we're already doing it day by day. So with that being said, thank y'all. And I know you're going to go back to eating your macaroni and cheese and playing with your kids. We appreciate you spending an hour with us. We'll put this out so you can take extra notes. Jessica, you are forever a part of our MPU family. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please let us know if we can do anything for you. Everybody have an amazing night. Go out and be great, and spread kindness and love to somebody.
Good night, all.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye, Jessica. Bye, Mary.